So this video is just going to be a brief introduction to philosophy as new students to the course. First of all, we're going to talk about what philosophy is and then look at the four main branches of philosophy that are used in kind of academic study. So first of all, what is philosophy? The formal dictionary definition of philosophy is the study of fundamental nature of knowledge, reality and existence, especially when considered an academic discipline. So that gives us a general kind of overview of the sorts of topics that you'd be looking at if you were studying philosophy. But I think it's actually more helpful to look at the root of the word, so the etymology of the word philosophy. And it actually comes from Greek, so it's a combination of two Greek words. And those two words actually mean love and wisdom. So philosophy by definition is the literal love of wisdom. It's not just a coincidence that the word philosophy has Greek origins, because the Greeks are quite famed for having spread philosophy to large parts of the world. There did exist philosophy, and there has always existed philosophy outside of Europe and other parts of the world, particularly places like China and India, but the philosophy that we tend to study in academic settings these days, particularly in the Western world, does have its origins in Greece. So as well as being considered, the love of wisdom, philosophy is also, it's not just a kind of a subject, but it's something that you do. It's an activity, as it were, and so if two people are engaging in a conversation about, should I tell my friend that they look terrible in their outfit, or should we use more of our taxes to fund healthcare rather than nuclear weapons, then they are technically participating in philosophy. They're doing philosophy by just having those conversations, those sorts of discourses between two people. So within philosophy as an academic discipline, there are four main branches of study. Have a quick look at some of those in a bit more detail. The first being ethics. So ethics is probably the one that you are most familiar with. That's when you're looking at kind of, the morality of actions, choices about what you should or should not do, what it means to be a good person, what the word good in and of itself means, what kind of rules you should live by and should govern your life. Those kind of topics are the ones covered by ethics. The second branch of philosophy is metaphysics, and if we look at the etymology of that word and we break it down, it is literally two words again. So it's meta, meaning above or beyond, and physics, which is kind of pertaining to the physical world. So as a branch of philosophy, metaphysics tends to concern itself with questioning things like what it means for something to be or to exist. We will be looking at things like that later on this term, so it is a word that you should familiarise yourself with. In terms of the origin of the word, it actually has again a connection to philosophy, the word metaphysics. You will see it in sort of scientific realms, metaphysical sciences, but it actually has its origin in philosophy, and it comes from the book Physics written by Aristotle. So Aristotle wrote the book Physics, which is about kind of movement and change, and so people that followed Aristotle came kind of after him, and were going, as they considered themselves to be going beyond what Aristotle had written in his book Physics, deemed what they were doing as metaphysics, because it was literally going above and beyond physics, as in Aristotle's book Physics. So the third branch of philosophy is epistemology. Epistemology again has Greek origins for the word, and it comes from two words, one meaning epistem, which means knowledge, and the other ology, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's common suffix of words, so ending to words, and it just means the study of. So epistemology is literally the study of knowledge. So because of its area of study, epistemology is sometimes referred to as the theory of knowledge, because it looks at kind of, what it means to know something and where the knowledge that we claim to have comes from, those kind of questions that it addresses. So in relation to where our knowledge comes from specifically, there are two main schools of thought within philosophy. There are rationalists who believe that all of our knowledge comes from reason. So everything that we know about the world, whether it's, maths like 2 + 2 = 4, or what a table is, all of that knowledge actually comes from our ability to reason. So being rational, rationalism, all relates to reason. Okay, so for rationalists, the majority of them anyway, they would consider that knowledge comes a priori. So that means prior to experience. Prior just meaning before, so a prior, before experience. I don't have to go out into the world and see that 2 + 2 = 4 by picking up 2 objects and then another 2 objects and counting them up. I can use my ability to reason to work out that 2 + 2 = 4. If I understand what the concepts of 2 and 2 are, then I can work that out without ever actually experiencing 2 objects combining with another 2 objects in order to work out that there are 4 in total, because that knowledge, as I say again, comes prior to experience. The other branch, the main school of thought within epistemology, is empiricism. So empiricists believe the opposite of rationalists, essentially. They believe that all of our knowledge comes from experience. So we can't have any knowledge at all without having some experience of something first. So whether that's knowing that 2 + 2 = 4, or knowing that a table is a table, we have to go out into the world and experience objects in order to be able to know what the meaning of the words that relate to them are, if we're talking about maths. So we have to go out into the world and see 2 objects combined with another 2 objects in order to know that there are 4 in total. We have to go out into the world and see a table with our eyes. We use our senses to interact with the world around us, and that is how we gain knowledge of objects and of anything. They don't believe that you can, purely using the power of reason, work out any new information, that we can gain knowledge from purely reason. So the opposing thought to a priori knowledge is a posteriori, which means after experience. So again, this is a term generally associated with empiricists, because they believe that knowledge comes after experience, not prior to, but after experience. The fourth and final branch of philosophy, of philosophical study, is logic. So logic doesn't concern itself with how we should or should not behave, isn't bothered about what we can know about the world or anything separate from itself. So logic really focuses on the validity of arguments, looking at its structure and trying to say whether it is valid or not. Now, to claim that an argument is valid means that there aren't any contradictions that have been made in reaching the final conclusion. So the ideas and the information that you've presented doesn't contradict the conclusion that you're trying to reach. So in philosophy, when we're talking about arguments, obviously we don't just mean people screaming at each other on the streets. What we're talking about here are a sequence of statements which reach some sort of conclusion, try to make some sort of judgment, and that's when you're putting forward an argument. So it's kind of the evidence that is backing up your end conclusion that you're trying to persuade someone of. Within logic, there are names given for the different types of sentences that you will find within an argument. So the sentences which contain information and they're telling you something new, they are what we call premises. So the cat is black, it's hot today, 70% of human body is water. These could all be premises within an argument. They're sentences which contain information. The conclusions, the conclusions are essentially the main points of an argument that the arguer is trying to persuade others of. So what is it that you're trying to convince people of? That would be most likely the conclusion to your argument. And you can usually tell that there's a conclusion being put forward or that's been reached in a piece of philosophical writing by the language that's used, because they tend to say things like in conclusion or therefore, to surmise, those kind of things. So just to recap that, you've got information for your argument in your premises, and then you've got the thing that you're trying to persuade the opponent, or the person listening to your argument of, in your conclusion. So it's almost like your main body, evidence backed up by your conclusion. So premise, conclusion. Now, relatively simple arguments will contain just a couple of premises before reaching a conclusion. So, for example, if it's Monday today, it's Tuesday tomorrow. It's Monday today, therefore it's Tuesday tomorrow. Okay, so the simple kind of 3-sentence structure. Those will be quite simple arguments, but you can, obviously, when philosophers write in their books, they don't tend to write in very brief and clear premise, conclusion formats like that. They'll write in continued prose, so just continuous words in the same way that you would in any other book. And so you kind of need to pick out where the information is being presented and defining where the premises are, where the conclusions and main points of the arguments are being reached, and labelling those as conclusions. So they can be a lot more complicated than just premise, conclusion. It often will look more like this, so a series of premises, one conclusion, and then further premises to add on to the first conclusion in order to formulate a second conclusion. So it's almost like a continuous sequence of statements being put forward in order to reach an ultimate conclusion. So you'll notice this looks quite similar to algebra. That's because logic it does use algebra. It essentially breaks down written prose and sentences into these premises and conclusions in order to use algebraic formulas and work out whether the arguments being presented are actually valid or not. And that's kind of like looking at the structure of the arguments, as we said logic does. So have we got steps missing in the sequence of that argument, which mean that we can no longer connect one premise to a conclusion, perhaps. Okay, so that's why they put it in this sort of format, because it makes it easier to see when there is something missing if it's written in a format of symbols. So if we have our sequence of premises and or conclusions which make our argument up, we can put those into a variety of different sort of formats, and so there are two main categories that we would put arguments in. Arguments tend to be either deductive arguments, which are arguments where the conclusion is 100% certain and most definitely has to be agreed based on the premises that are put forward. So you'll present some information in your premises, and assuming that you agree with that information, you therefore have to agree to the conclusion. And then the other type of argument is an inductive argument, which is more scientific in its approach. So it kind of gathers evidence in order to look for likely conclusions about what might happen, or likely predictions rather, about what might happen in the future. They're not 100% certain, but they're likely based on the evidence that's been gathered. So an example of a deductive argument would be what's known as a syllogism. So a syllogism is just kind of like a way of formatting a series of premises and conclusions. It's this sort of name given to the order that they're put in. So a really famous syllogism is one about Socrates, the Greek philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher. So it goes that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So if you can see there, we've broken that down into its kind of algebraic formula, the logical formula there. All P's are Q's, so all men being P are Q being mortal, X being Socrates is a P man, therefore X Socrates is a Q mortal. If you look at it in kind of a Venn diagram format, it makes a little bit more sense. So we've got the category of men, and everything that fits in this category of men also fits into the wider category of mortal. Okay, so all the men are inside of this category of mortal. So therefore we know that if Socrates is inside the category of men, he's also inside the category of mortal. We can see that from the way that the diagram is structured. Okay, so that is a deductive argument because it's 100% certain. It's not possible for Socrates to be a man and not be in the category of mortal as well. He couldn't be a man and be anywhere outside of that category because all men fit inside this category. Therefore, it is 100% certain the conclusion that's being reached. But it's not necessarily true in actual fact. So it is what we call a valid argument, but it's not necessarily a sound argument. So it's valid because if you agree with the first two premises, all P's are Q, X is a P, then you have to agree with the conclusion, therefore X is a Q. There aren't any sort of missing steps or anything like that in the logic. It all adds up together to make the conclusion true. But the problem is we could put different values in as P and Q, which we know for a fact not to be true, and the argument would still be valid. So it would still be a certain conclusion, even though it's not actually true in reality. And that means that the argument is unsound. So just have a look at an example there. One simple change, if we put, rather than the category of mortals, if we put vegetarians there instead, and we said that all men are vegetarians, Socrates is a man, therefore he is also a vegetarian. Well, we know for a fact that not all men are vegetarians. So we know for a fact that this should not be entirely inside there. There are some men who are, so perhaps it should be more kind of half in, half out, maybe even less than half in. But the problem with this type of argument is that you can plug in statements which are not true in reality in order to prove your conclusion. And they will still be valid arguments. They're just not sound because they're not true in actual fact. And the final, just go back to inductive arguments. So I say more like the scientific method. You perhaps come up with a hypothesis or something, you gather evidence, and then you test your evidence, make predictions about the future. That's a simplified version of the scientific method. And inductive arguments are quite similar. So an example of an inductive argument might be if you used statistical induction. So statistical induction is where you kind of say that a certain percentage of a group, so a sample of a group, has a certain feature or characteristic, therefore that will be true of the remainder of the group. So if you think of it a bit like this, so we've got, say, a tub with 100 different balls in it. We want to know how many are black, how many are white. We know there's only black and white in the tub, so we want to know how many of each are each colour. What you want to do statistical induction is take a sample size out. So you take 5 balls out, you find 3 of those balls are red, 2 of them are white. Okay, well therefore my inductive argument is going to be that 60% of the balls inside are black, because 60% of the ones that I took out were black. Now that's not a certain conclusion. We don't know for a fact that actually 60% of those balls inside that jar are black. We're just presuming based on our sample set of data that we've looked at. And that's the problem with inductive arguments, because they are essentially just presumptions. They're presumptions based on evidence, but still presumptions and therefore not certain. So why is all of this useful? Well, because when you're writing your philosophical essays, obviously you'll have your introductions, your conclusions, and your main body is where this information comes in helpful. Knowing the difference between inductive and deductive arguments, knowing how to pick apart an argument and to see if there is a missing step in the argument, to see if they've tried to sneakily stick in some premises which are not actually true. That's what you'll be doing in your main body arguments, because you'll be looking at the arguments of philosophers and picking them apart, hopefully trying to work out whether they are valid, first of all, so are there any contradictions, errors in their logic, and then whether they are sound. Are their premises and their conclusions actually true in real life?